Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another Instant Deck Tech. So, we've been moving to a schedule for Instant Deck Tech with Modern Mondays, Standard Tuesdays, Wildcard Wednesdays. Thursday is Tier Thursday. So, we kind of started this last week, but we've had requests to go over some of the tier decks, especially from Modern and Legacy, but we'll throw Standard in as well. So, Thursday is going to be our day. So, once a week, we'll look at a tier list and kind of break down how that list works. So, this week, we are looking at one of the top three decks in Modern, sometimes the number one deck in Modern, in Affinity. So the build we're looking at is from Paul Myers. Recently took him to a top 8 finish at a SCG Open. So congrats to Paul on their finish with the deck. A quick reminder before we break it all down: if you enjoy this deck and you want to see it made into videos, take a minute, click the like button, the subscribe button, leave a comment, anything you can do to support your deck, because whichever deck is most popular gets a shot at being made into videos next week. So, Affinity is an artifact-based aggro deck, and the whole idea of this deck is to spew your hand on the battlefield as quickly as possible and hopefully kill your opponent in the first 3 or 4 turns. So, the deck plays a lot of cards that might seem underpowered. Creatures like Memnite and Ornithopter, but the idea of these cards is they facilitate really fast opening. So, you want to be playing multiple things on turn 1, hopefully using those things to enable playing a 2-drop on turn 1, and that really sets you off to the races. So the idea here is, on turn 1, you get your opening hand, you play your Memnites, your Ornithopters, hopefully you have Mox Opal and Springleaf Drum. So Mox Opal is a mana source if you have 3 artifacts, and with Memnites and Ornithopters and Darksteel Citadel, an artifact land, and Springleaf Drum, a cheap artifact, you can usually turn this on turn 1, and if you're turning it on off of Memnites and Ornithopters, you're going to have 2 mana, one from your land, one from the Mox Opal. It also works with Springleaf Drum, which is essentially a free artifact if you have a 0-cost creature, because you have to tap your land to play it, because it costs 1 mana, but you can immediately tap your Memnite or your Ornithopter, which is summoning sick anyway, to make a mana, and it ups your artifact count. That's another thing that it wants to do, is just have a lot of artifacts on the battlefield. So you dump your hand, and then, in the worst case, you're going to have mana to play one of your 1-drops, Signal Pest or Vault Scourge. So even just going, for example, Memnite, Signal Pest allows you to start attacking for 4 on turn 2, which is pretty reasonable. You have a bunch of bodies, hopefully they'll pay off later. Vault Scourge gives you a flyer with lifelink, which can be relevant, but the real payoff cards are the 2-drops. So ideally, the best hands from Affinity are going to play Steel Overseer or Arcbound Ravager on turn 1. So you play your Memnites, you make your mana with Mox Opals, your Springleaf Drums, and if you get your Steel Overseer down, on turn 2, you untap with your Ornithopters, your Signal Pests, your Memnites, you tap Steel Overseer, pumps everything up, makes sure artifacts even bigger of threats, and helps you to kill your opponent really quickly. Arcbound Ravager is a payoff card for having a bunch of artifacts. That's why Springleaf Drum is great as a free artifact. Darksteel Citadel is great as an artifact land, because you can sack those to put a counter on Ravager, and then how the deck often wins is you tack with all these really cheap artifact creatures, and then when one goes unblocked, you can sack a bunch of stuff to put counters on Ravager, then you sack the Ravager to dump all your counters on your Signal Pest or your Ornithopter and hit for a ton of damage. Even a bigger payoff for the deck is Cranial Plating, another card that just cares about a bunch of artifacts. So this is the card that can close out games super quick, just like Arcbound Ravager. Steel Overseer is the 2-drop that's great with the go wide strategy. Ravager and Cranial Plating let the deck go tall. So you take in, play all these artifacts. You have like 6, 7, 8 artifacts on the battlefield for just 2 mana. Cranial Plating is going to start giving a creature +8/+0, +9/0. You have flyers, stick it on a flyer. That's like a 2-turn clock with Cranial Plating. Sometimes even a 1-turn clock that we'll talk about later. Plus, it's got this broken equip ability that only came out in the very first equipment, and that is that you can attach it to a creature for 2 black mana. So that means you can essentially equip it at instant speed. So much like Arcbound Ravager, you attack with a bunch of artifacts, and then you can pay 2 black and just move Cranial Plating onto whatever creature happens to be unblocked to make sure you get in that combat damage. The deck, as far as kind of closing out the game, has a couple of 3-drops. Edge Champion is really good just because it's hard to deal with. You have a few artifacts, it has protection from all colors, so it can't be blocked. It's really good at blocking if things go wrong. Can't be killed very easily, so you stick your Cranial Plating on it, and it's just like 6, 8, 10 damage a turn that your opponent can't really do anything about. Master of Ethereum's another lord. It pumps up all your artifacts, plus it gets huge, often being a 7/7, an 8/8, a 10/10, because it gets +1/+1 for all of your artifacts. As far as removal, you got Galvanic Blast, which is almost always 4 damage in the deck, plus 4 damage to the face for 1 mana is super efficient, so it can also help close out games. And one of the things that makes Affinity so scary is it's super resilient because of creature lands. So even if your opponent can Supreme Verdict, or Anger of the Gods, or Pyroclasm away your board, you have these creature lands that can take over the game. They work well with Steel Overseer and with your Arcbound Ravager, because you can put a bunch of counters on them. They dodge sorcery speed removal. And then Inkmoth is a lot of times a one-hit kill with Cranial Plating. You get so many artifacts on the battlefield. On like turn 3, if you can get an unblocked Inkmoth attacking, you just put the plating on it and can deal 10 poison to your opponent all at once. The mana base, apart from the creature lands, you get the Darksteel Citadels, which I mentioned, good with Ravager, ups your artifact count, Glimmer Voids to make mana of any color, which helps with the instant speed attach cost on your Cranial Platings, also relevant for sideboard cards. In a single mountain, in the sideboard, Gurper Aethergrid is kind of the way to fight through hate. Stony Silence is a problem with this deck. It can really wreck the deck. You can't equip your stuff, you can't activate your Ravager, you can't even make mana with some of your lands. So Stony Silence is a huge sideboard card against it. Gurper Aethergrid helps the deck fight through it because even though you can't activate your artifacts, you can activate the Ether Grid by tapping 2 artifacts, so you just kind of tap all your stuff, deal 3, 4, 5 damage, next turn do it again, and ping your opponent to death that way. Edge Champion helps the deck fight through removal. Then you get a bunch of interesting options. Whip Flare is a one-sided Pyroclasm since it only deals damage to non-artifact creatures, so you wipe away all your opponent's Dark Confidants, Lingering Souls tokens, things like that, and not hurt your own creatures. Thoughtseize, you can cast it just like Spell Pierce. You got black and blue and red options in the sideboard thanks to your Glimmer Voids making mana of any color, and your Springleaf Drum and your Mox Opal, so you have a lot of sources that can make mana of any color. Ancient Grudge to kill ensnaring bridges, and then some more artifacts. Spellskite to protect against Infect and other targeted removal, Grafdigger's Cage for graveyard decks, and a Chalice of the Void. And that is Affinity for Modern, and that's been our Tier Thursday Instant Deck Tech. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon.